Dun, dun, dun. Greetings, fellow snowflakes. A lot of people, especially on YouTube, seem to want to deny the existence of transgender people, that there's any validity at all to transgender people. Some people, it's just the non-binary people that they doubt really exist, but with some people it's all transgender people, and they like to talk about facts over feelings. You know, the way you feel inside doesn't count, it's the facts of the matter that count. Well, let's look at some facts. Firstly, for all those who are like, this is a load of Tumblr nonsense, it's not new. In India, for many thousands of years, there have been a group of people called Hijra, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and in Native American tribes there were people who Westerners call Birdake. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right either, but and there's the Mukse in Mexico, there are the Katois, Toms and Ds in Thailand, and in Japan, from the Edo period onwards, effeminate male performers would dress and live as women. Not just when they're performing, but all the time, and are simply socialized as women. In ancient Assyria, there were cult prostitutes, which included males who wore women's clothes, carried female symbols, and sometimes even pretended to give birth. So, yeah, there's been a lot of gender variance for many thousands of years in many different parts of the world. Whether you consider it transgender by today's standards, or whether you want to call it cross-dressing or whatever else you want to call it, I don't know, but it's there. It's existed all over the world in many different cultures and for many thousands of years. And there have been examples of trans women and trans men going back at least to the 19th century that we know about. I mean, there's Herman Karl, also known as Sophia Hedwig, who was a transgender woman in the 19th century. There was Lily Elbe, that's whose life the Danish Girl film is based on. Lily Elbe, who is a Danish transgender woman who transitioned in 1930. Then there was Christine Jurgensen. Christine Jurgensen was an American trans woman who was the first person to become widely known in the United States for having sex reassignment surgery, and that happened in 1952, I believe. And there was Michael Dillon, who was the first trans man to have a phalloplasty, that's the creation of a penis, surgically. Born Laura Moore Dillon, Michael Dillon transitioned in the 40s, actually. So there's all that history, and non-binary might not be as new a thing as you think it is. There was an interesting person in the 19th century called christened Earl Lind, but calling herself Jenny June, who did identify in part as a woman, but also in part as an androgyne, which comes from androgynous, and kind of means you're in between the genders. I believe, in a slightly otherkin way, she also referred to herself as a fairy, which is a metaphor for being androgynous that I have embraced before in the past as well, hence my name Fairy Kim. So there you are. There are gender-neutral pronouns that have been coined over the years. Interestingly, the singular they, using they as a gender-neutral pronoun for a person of indeterminate, undetermined gender, it was commonly used that way in English right up until 1745, when grammarians decided that it was incorrect to do that, and that he would be a better gender-neutral pronoun to use. So make of that what you will, but various gender-neutral pronouns have been suggested over the years. The gender-neutral pronoun thon was first used in 1858, ip and lee in 1884, in 1888, co in 1970, a in 1975, m in 1977. The gender-neutral title, mx, instead of Mr. or Mrs, you put mx for gender-neutral, for non-binary people, I guess. The first use of that gender-neutral title was in 1977, all a long time before Tumblr. And the word cisgender to mean people who are not transgender, the words neutoir and genderqueer, both for non-binary identities, were all coined in 1995 or thereabouts. Again, although fairly recent, still long before Tumblr. Interestingly, with regards to the whole nature versus nurture debate, there is an example, a very famous example, where someone was raised as a different gender to what their biological sex was to start with. David Peter Riemer was the victim, I suppose you might want to call, of a botched circumcision, and they decided to basically perform surgery on this child to make them female, or at least outwardly seem to be female, and to raise him as a girl. So here is and this was from baby onwards. So this was an example of someone who was always raised as a girl, socialized, to use the radical feminist term, as a girl, and yet he was convinced throughout that he was a guy. And when the truth was finally told to him, he did indeed attempt to transition to live as a guy, and eventually commit suicide. This is complicated a little bit by the fact that the way the doctors treated him and attempted to socialize him as female did involve some pretty unethical things involving his brother, and it's kind of child abuse, really, and it's a bit sick. So that's probably more of the reason why he committed suicide in the end. But there is an example there of someone who was raised to be and socialized to be a girl, and yet the gender identity in their brain meant that they knew that they were a boy, even though by this point physically weren't anymore. So yeah, an example where you can eliminate the physical and the social, the socialization out of the equation, and there is something in the brain that tells you what gender you are, clearly. Talking of brains and gender, there have been a number of studies about the brains of men and women and transgender men and women done in recent years. The first of which was in the mid-90s. In 1995, there was a study done where it's found that the stria terminalis, a region in the brain that is bigger in men than in women, I believe, transgender people tend to have a size of this region more in keeping with the gender that they identify with than the gender of the sex they were assigned at birth. And a follow-up study was done in 2000 which used the number of neurons in that region instead of the actual volume and size of the region, with even more dramatic results showing that transgender people have it in line with their identified gender, not their assigned gender. Another follow-up in 2002 suggested that this dimorphism doesn't occur until adulthood, but another study in 2006 found that actually that was wrong, and it confirmed the earlier results, that these are real differences. And a 2008 study discovered that there was a variant of the CYP17 gene in female to male transsexuals that was absent in male to female transsexuals. In another 2008 study, there was found to be another region of the brain, other than the one previously found, that also differs in terms of men and women, and also differs with transgender people in respect that they are more like the gender they identify with than the gender they were assigned at birth. A 2009 MRA study found the amounts of grey matter and the amounts of white matter in men and women. Again, that transgender people are more in line with the kind of brain structures of the gender they identify with than with the gender they were assigned at birth. The evidence is there. It is quite compelling. They all involve major brain structures, which is not the sort of things that can actually be restructured and reformed by new experiences, for example. And in many cases they included controls to eliminate the possibility that it was because of exposure to cross-gender hormones. It all seems very convincing that there are marked differences between the sexes, and that transgender people fall in the range more typical of their identified gender than their assigned gender. And yet, because it involves amount of, size of, number of, whatever, there is plenty of possibility, although it hasn't been proven yet, for some people to lie somewhere in between if they're non-binary. In any case, by this point, it is simply denial of evidence to claim that, at least in the case of binary transgender people, that they are special snowflakes and aren't really the gender they claim to be. To deny the validity of trans women or trans men at this stage is really akin to being a flat earther, a creationist, or a Holocaust denier. Let's look at some of the medical procedures that trans people undergo. Medical transition usually involves hormone replacement therapy, and also often or sometimes involves surgical procedures. Trans women are given estrogen and either anti-androgens or something called GnRH agonists, both of which are designed to prevent the testosterone from having its effects, so that the estrogen can have its effects better, to be honest. Trans men are given testosterone only. It's worth bearing in mind here that these are the same hormones that people's bodies naturally produce, and that both men and women naturally contain both estrogen and testosterone in their bodies. The hormone replacement therapy merely tips the balance. Unfortunately, testosterone seems to be the stronger chemical here, and so trans women also need to block their androgens for the estrogen to be effective. Genital surgery for trans women involves removal of the testicles and some of the penile tissue, and the use of the glands of the penis to create a clitoris, inversion of penile skin to create a vaginal lining, and a use of scrotal tissue to create labia. It is notable that the way bodies naturally develop as male or female does involve the same tissue being structured in different ways. Clitoris and penis are effectively the same kind of organ. Labia and scrotum are made of the same kind of tissue, and although we can't actually change gonads through medical science yet, it is also true that ovaries and testicles are the same kind of organ. In a way, sex reassignment surgery replicates as much as we can the way nature would have made someone if they had been born the opposite sex. Genital surgery for trans men involves a penis created either from a clitoris enlarged by hormones or from tissue grafted from elsewhere with a prosthesis for erection. The labia are also fused to form a scrotum, and prosthetic testicles are inserted. It's not ideal. In a way, trans women have it easier in that regard. Other surgeries include breast removal for trans men, a mastectomy, womb and ovary removal for trans men, which is a hysterectomy, breast augmentation for trans women, facial feminization surgery for trans women, trachea shave for trans women. Some of these procedures are optional, but obviously all of them are optional, aren't they? It's up to you what you have done to your own body. But yeah, those are some of the surgeries that people have. So before I leave you, I want to talk a little bit about puberty blockers and transgender children, and it's possible I'll get some flack from my fellow transgender people on this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I do think it has come to my attention that there might be actually some real concerns about using puberty blockers on transgender children. While it is true that nobody is suggesting that children should be given hormones or go through surgery, those procedures are not available until adulthood, and it is also true that blockers simply delay puberty. Nevertheless, I do think there are some real risks and concerns. There are some health risks connected with the use of puberty blockers, but then I suppose there's health risks with anything you do to your body. But in a way, maybe hormones would be safer for a transgender teenager. After all, it only mimics the natural process that would occur if they were the opposite sex. But anyway, one concern, and I do think it's worth raising, is that it is hard to establish in childhood the difference between a genuinely transgender child and someone who is simply gender non-conforming. But even more important, I think, is it's a very real practical concern. There is a very real practical problem, at least with regards to male to female transgender children, that if they do not go through their natural puberty, then there is simply not enough penile tissue to construct a vagina if they choose to go through surgery later in life. The alternative to using penile skin to make a vagina is to use tissue from the colon. But this is not ideal, as it will often need replacing at certain intervals throughout the person's life, every 10 years or so, I think. Plus, penile skin is more sensitive than colon. This insight was actually provided by a surgeon who performs sex reassignment surgery, who was giving a talk at a transgender meeting that I went to recently. So, this is a very real example of how it may be in the transgender child's best interest to go through their natural puberty. Personally, I think it may be better to let nature take its course, and then they can transition once they are adult, with the right kind of support from their parents, teachers, etc., and possibly with a good bit of counselling to get them through it. With affirmation and validation of their gender identity, letting them live as the gender they identify as, and plenty of reassurance and support that they will be able to transition when they reach adulthood, puberty need not be the horror that it has often been in the past for transgender children. You may disagree, but I think certainly in the case of male to female trans kids, that it might actually be in their best interest to let nature take its course if they intend to have a fully functioning vagina in the future. Anyway, thanks for watching. We're all different, we're all special, snowflakes unite. Talking of brains, talking of brains, talking of brains, talking of brains.